a lot of you are jumping on, so we'll give it just a few more seconds, as we're expecting a good number today. Well, good afternoon or good morning, wherever you are. Thank you for attending our Wednesday webinar series today. I'm Susan Kent with Talent Connections and Career Spa. And our presentation today, The Heart Work of Change. I think you're going to love this. I love the play on words. This is a 1-hour webinar. And if you have any technical questions, you may call 888-799-9666, extension 2. And just to remind you, as participants, you're muted, but please use the questions feature, the Q&A feature at any time to submit your questions, and we will get to those as we can. We always have a question and answer period at the end of the presentation. This webinar is approved for 1 SHRM Professional Development credit, and we'll share that activity number with you at the end of the presentation. So let me introduce Kevin Phillips. If you did not attend our webinar previously when Kevin spoke, you're gonna be in for a treat today. Kevin has a 25-year background in marketing, sales, and service and technology. When he was an executive at AT&T, he's been the board chair for a nonprofit, and now he is sharing a lot of that experience and motivation as the founder of Build Them Up, where the mission is to help leaders improve organizational results by investing in the people who create them. So Kevin, I'll turn it over to you, and thank you for joining us again.
Thank you, Susan, very much. The heart work of change. Would someone please stop this roller coaster? I mean, if we were novelists writing the next New York Times bestseller, I don't think any of us could imagine a better chaos-causing, fear-instilling, and world-debilitating change than the one we're living right now. And what better time for us to talk about how to lead change than right now? Because chances are, every one of us, in probably multiple roles of our life, we're leading or helping guide others through change. At work, perhaps if we're a volunteer at a nonprofit, maybe at our church, in our own families, helping our children navigate. One of my friends, her son's graduation was supposed to be this weekend from New York University, and we were talking about that and the changes that she's trying to help him navigate, because getting into a career is a little different right now. A lot of change going on. Entire industries are not only changing to address this pandemic, but just imagine the kind of change that they face, that we all face after this, because things will not go back to the same. Yes, some things will, but there will be, healthcare may never be like it was. And education, online education, will probably be adopted in much higher rates than it has been before. And just consider remote work. We've all been forced to figure out ways. Sometimes it's clumsy, but technology has allowed us to work remotely, and we're getting used to it. And we're realizing that, yeah, it's not as good as face-to-face in some ways, but it's better in other ways. So I think we will find that remote work will continue to be something that we were driving through change in our organization. Retail stores will probably not be the same. Restaurants probably won't be the same. So buckle your seatbelt, because this is an exhilarating ride already, and it's going to continue to be. Change is hard. It's always hard. And on some level, it's true of every kind of change, isn't it? And today, what we're going to discuss is how to lead change more effectively, how to lead change in a way so that outcomes, the likelihood of positive outcomes are increased. How we lead change has a significant impact on how others process it, how they embrace it, and how they make it work. Because at the end of the day, rarely is change effective because the leader makes a decision. It takes other people to make the change work. Sometimes it's the people on your team, your employees, but it's also your customers. Customers have to survive your change too. And oftentimes we're going to talk about reasons that change often fails. And sometimes it's because we forget some of the people who are impacted by that change. The goal of change is always to perfectly execute and have a smooth implementation, where over time, outcomes get better and improve steadily, right? That's the goal of change. And I don't know about you, but when I implement change, when I lead change, it always is beautiful and green and nice and smooth up and to the right. Of course, you know I'm kidding. This is always my goal, but the truth is change is messy. It looks something like this, where there are ups and downs. And when you think you're going to go up tomorrow, then you realize your result actually went down and you're not sure why. And you almost get to the point where you're just happy if it's up and to the right. You don't almost care sometimes whether it's even smooth, because it's hard to achieve smooth. And we've kind of gotten to the point where we expect this in many ways. So if change is so messy, why would we change? And the answer to that is sometimes it's not our choice. It's imposed upon us. Sometimes it might be by regulation from the government, but it could also be a competitor makes a move that we weren't expecting. They might launch a new product, or maybe a promo offer that we weren't expecting. Sometimes it's generational, because as we all know, some of us were not raised on social media. In fact, the internet didn't exist when I was a kid. But that technology shift has changed consumer behavior, it's changed our social behavior, and it has disrupted many industries. But sometimes change is by choice. We want to grow our business. Maybe we want to grow ourselves, so we go to college or we go to some kind of training to learn. That's a change. Sometimes we want to change our impact. We want to increase our impact. Maybe we want to create work-life balance, or maybe we want to give our kids a better life. We're wanting to achieve something. So there's a reason that we change. Sometimes it's because someone forces it on us. Sometimes it's because we force it on ourselves. But it doesn't matter why we're changing. Change is hard and it's painful. And it's not that I'm trying to be Debbie Downer here. I'm just trying to speak the truth. You already know this. Change is incredibly difficult. One of my best jobs was also my worst job. I was asked to take over some call centers at Bell South. And the situation was this. I got a phone call. Kevin, we need you to come over. We need you to turn around this organization. It is in a growing part of our business. We're growing so fast we can't even keep up. But the customer sat scores are awful. The financial performance and the efficiency metrics are awful. The employee dissatisfaction levels are awful. And you have 1 year to turn this around, or we're going to outsource this entire call center operation. But you can't tell them that. I was excited and scared to death at the same time. I learned so much in there, often because I made mistakes. I made some judgment calls that weren't right. But I also learned because I figured out something. A few of the things we're going to talk about today, I figured out that the people who make the change make the change. I thought I was the boss. I thought I was going to make all these decisions and I was going to tell them what to do, and they were going to go do it. And because of all of my knowledge, things would get better. And what I discovered is they knew more about what was the effective way to make a change than I did. And once I figured out how to tap into that, once I figured out how to get out of their way, positive things happened. And when I left that job, it was supposed to be a 1-year assignment. I was there for a little bit over 2 years. Every metric had improved double or triple digits. Not because I was amazing, but because I got out of the way and let the amazing people drive the change. So why is it that change is hard? It's actually a law, a physics law. Now, I'm not a scientist, but we know that Isaac Newton had a principle. It's called the law of inertia. An object that is set in motion will remain in motion until an object with greater force changes that. An object at rest will remain at rest until a greater force forces it to move. That's true with us. So what you see here, the gray line shows what we would like for change to be, where over time, outcomes improve. But the truth of the matter is, we get started and then something goes wrong. What goes wrong? Well, it could be anything. Sometimes it's a defect in the system, or sometimes there's a power outage and all of a sudden the systems aren't working at all. Or it could be that we had changed a process, but we forgot there was one use case that we didn't see very often. And when does it show up? On the very day we launch. But let's talk about changes that aren't related to work. Let's talk about trying to change our own habits. Have any of you maybe tried to stop biting your fingernails, or maybe you tried to lose 20 pounds or stop smoking? Things get in the way that you don't expect at the beginning, that slow you down, that might actually undercut you, might even make you question whether it's the right change. And the truth is, we all know this intuitively, that when you start a change, things often get worse. They almost always get worse before they get better. And here's what's sad is oftentimes as leaders, despite the fact that we know this, we launch a change, and 2 days later, we're looking at our metrics and we realize things have gone south. And we immediately start trying to fix it, because that's what leaders do. We like to fix things. And why is it going south? And we often assume it's because the people are resisting. And people often resist. But we often respond to that downturn in exactly the wrong way. We should have expected it, but we didn't, and so we went out and overreacted. I will never forget sitting in a meeting. We had a very large change going on in a corporation, and this was a day-long readout with the vice chairman of the board. He only had one person higher than him, and that was the chairman of the board. His name was Dick Anderson. He's now I think he is CEO of Fulton County in Atlanta. But he listened to this long conversation about what was going right and the 3 or 4 things that was going wrong. And we were so nervous because the things that were going wrong, they weren't good at all. And he sat there, and after we got done, there was this pregnant pause. I hate those. Don't you hate those? And he said, I learned something a long time ago, folks, that I should never underestimate the power of a frontline manager to ignore a policy decision that I've made. Now, here was the guy who controlled the paychecks of thousands of employees, and he realized he wasn't completely in control, and it gave us good perspective. On the best of days, change is hard, and we know that. But let's consider what happens if you make a change while you're making a change. What if there are multiple changes? This is what happens. You're making a change, things start going wrong. There's resistance, there's a defect in the system, the process didn't consider a certain exception, and now you're introducing another change. What if you're introducing a third change and a fourth change? It has an impact. It wears people down. You got to consider this. And so the whole purpose for our conversation today is for us to talk about the people impacts of change. And when we're leading a change, how we can use this insight to change the way we change, to change the way we plan for change, to accommodate these learnings in our change plan. So if you know things are going to get worse before they get better, build that into your plan. Learning a new skill always slows you down. If you are an expert at riding a bicycle and you decide that you're so good at doing a 1-mile trek in X number of minutes that now you're going to learn to do that same trek on a skateboard, guess what? You learn it, you can eventually accomplish it, but probably your first day, you're probably going to spend some time on the concrete. Imagine if you were trying to learn to skateboard while you're also trying to learn to juggle, learning 2 things at once. This is not something that you don't already know. It's something that we usually factor into our change plans. And so that's what I'm encouraging you to do today, is consider the impact of those changes. But there's more. When we start implementing change, it increases, it's unsettling. It increases uncertainty, causes doubt. Things get muddy. You thought you knew how things worked, and now all of a sudden they don't work that way, and you're not quite yet sure how they work. And then you get disoriented because you can't find your way around. You don't know how to navigate like before. And very often your gets raised, and I'm not sure if I can trust someone's intentions. What else have they not told me? Now, I worked at Bell South, I mentioned earlier. When AT&T bought Bell South in early 2007, it was the first time in my career that I had experienced change that was so completely outside of my control. where I didn't have any line of sight of whether I would even still have a career. The headquarters was going to be in a different city. Almost every one of the officers that I had worked with at Bell South took their golden parachute and left. I don't blame them. So I was going to have to start rebuilding a network. And I have to tell you, every one of the things on this list I felt. I was uncertain whether I would still have a career. I doubted whether I would have the kind of connection with these new leaders because they're in a different city. You don't see them in the hall. You don't see them in the cafeteria. I didn't know their way of doing business. And I was not really sure I trusted everything I heard. And that leads to resistance and exhaustion. It's tiring to go through change. And it's natural for us to resist something that's that we're not imposing upon ourselves. And these two factors have huge impacts on how humans respond to change. And as a leader, we need to factor that into our plan. When there's a change, there's a sense of loss, a loss of what you knew, what you were familiar with, a loss of the rules of the game, a loss of the connections and relationships that you had sometimes. You feel loss. And the social scientist, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, created a framework for understanding how people grieve. And in many cases, change, even business change, personal change, think back in your own experiences, it creates a similar sense of grief. And I think we can learn a lot about leading people through change by looking at what Kubler-Ross said about leading people through grief. And what she said is that over time, people who experience grief go through 5 cycles. Now, that you'll if you were to pull this up on the web, there are several different versions of this. There's one version, 7 steps. We're going to go with the 5 today. But the first step is denial. They're shocked. They're numb. They've been caught off guard. They didn't know that there was going to be a change. Or they might have known there was going to change, but they didn't realize what it was going to be or how big it was going to be. And they're thinking, there must be a mistake. And then they start clinging to false hope. Maybe they're even avoiding it. They're confused. They're afraid. They're in denial of what's going to happen. And then they move to anger. Something's being done to me and I don't like it. They're irritated. They're anxious. Why me? And then they start realizing, you know what? It's kind of moving along. I don't even know how to process it. What do I do? I mean, so many options. If I go this way, what's going to happen? And they're just overwhelmed and they feel helpless. Sometimes they're hostile. There's a sense of giving up. You see despondence set in. Maybe there's some silence. They're a little bit withdrawn. And by the way, this is also changing your family. If you're a parent and your kids are going through something, you'll see similar things here. And then they start bargaining. You know, can I avoid this pain? Or maybe I can't avoid it, but can I mitigate it in some way? Maybe you're negotiating for an extended period or negotiating for the change to be implemented in a series of phases instead of a single phase. Maybe we hold something off until a later date. You're struggling to find meaning from it. And then eventually there's an acceptance. And this acceptance doesn't necessarily mean that I've embraced it and I love it and I want it and I can't wait and I'm a cheerleader for it. It might mean that, but it might just mean, look, I realize this is going to happen. I can't stop it. So I might as well figure out what am I going to do to deal with it. And I start exploring those options and building a plan and taking steps. And this is true for people who are going through career transition. I know that Talent Connections also has Career Spa where you're helping people through transition. And these are the stages that you go through. These are stages you go through even when you want the change. You might go through them at a different pace. And keep in mind, people do go through these. You know, some people move through them quickly and some people get stuck on one stage or another. But when you're building a change plan and you've got a group of people that you're trying to work through, you got to think about how you're going to help them get through this, because that is the goal, is to help people move forward. And you can't be in denial yourself that just because you might have already in this particular change reached the level of acceptance, you can't deny that other people might still be in denial and anger. And so building these human elements is important. But this is not personal, right? This is work. We're not doing this change to somebody. We're doing it for the business. This is not about them. But at the end of the day, the truth is change is deeply personal. Because what happens at work, you take home. And what happens at home, you take to work. And what happens at church, you take to work and you take to home. And what happens in your community organization, you take home and to work and to church. We are one person. And while we might try to create walls and be a separate person everywhere, we really aren't. And everything is personal, and especially to the extent that change is going to make me question my self-worth, or it's going to cause me to be concerned about whether I'm going to get a paycheck or have to look for a job, or maybe I'll have a job, but it won't be as fulfilling. Yes, it is deeply personal. Change is personal. And as a leader of change, if you ignore that it's personal, you're going to miss the ability to influence human behavior. So let me ask you, what do we normally do when we implement change? Well, many of us have gone to, management school, and they teach us all about control, operations, and knowing your metrics, and having a process, and having policies, and having accountability in place, having a list of actions and who's going to take them and when they're due, and a budget so we know that all of those things are great to control. But at the end of the day, we can't really control everything. In fact, we can't really control anyone. I'm not saying that there aren't some things that we can control. There are some things. And there might be some people, but I don't really think there's anybody you can control. But here's what you can do. Where you can't control, you can influence. So while you cannot control everything, you can influence most things. And while you can't control anyone, you can influence most everyone. And influence is where you can significantly increase the effectiveness of your change. So yes, do things that create control with your methods and your systems and your metrics and performance views and things like tying performance to pay. Yes, do all those things. Those are very effective control techniques. But don't think that's enough, because it's not. That will help you implement change, but it won't be enough to really achieve the kind of effectiveness that you've planned for and hoped for and built for. You need to influence the human elements of change. So if you will, think about a change that you're leading right now, a change at work, maybe a change in a community organization where you volunteer, maybe a change you're leading in your home with your children or one at your church. Think about a change. And as we talk through this, listen with an ear toward how the principles that we're discussing might help you with the change that you're leading now. Now, one thing that we're not going to talk about in this workshop is whether the change that you're leading is the right change or not. Now, that's important. You want to lead smart change. You want to lead change that's compelling and valuable, but that's not what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about how you lead the change. So we're assuming that the change that you're leading is the right one for purposes of this conversation. And know that I'm likely to exaggerate things for purposes of creating enough contrast for understanding. I know that things are always as clean as I might describe them or as messy as I might describe them, but I'm doing that on purpose just to help frame this for learning purposes. So at the end of the day, what is your competitive advantage of any organization, business organization, or a nonprofit? Your advantage is not your prices and your technology and your process, or even your cost structure. All of that might be an advantage, but it won't be an advantage long, because those are easy for competitors to come along and copy and duplicate. And frankly, with the way things are today, with technology as it is, they can be duplicated so fast it'll make your head spin. You won't stay far enough ahead of your competition to maintain a competitive advantage with those. But your team and their creativity, the passion that they have, the loyalty that they have towards you, their leadership skills, the relationships they have with others, that cannot be copied and pasted. That is your competitive advantage. Your employees and your volunteers and your customers, even your parishioners, your donors, your suppliers, those are your advantage. And if you want to influence the outcomes of your change, you will find the most effective way to do it is by tackling the people. I'm not saying ignore the technology. I'm not saying ignore the processes and the controls, but I believe the game changer for effective change are the human elements. There's an attitude that's required here. And I'm going to start with this. This is kind of a touchy-feely kind of. At the end of the day, if you were a leader, everything you do is about people. Chances are, as a leader, you're not the one who touches the technology. You probably are not the one that talks to customers to sell them or to service their needs. You're probably not the accountant who keeps track of what's coming in and going out. You're probably not doing the things of business. You're leading people. And if you want to harvest the value of those people and their potential, there's going to have to be some hard work done with you. And it starts with valuing people, putting people first and leading heart forward. And if this is not true for you, and it's not true for everyone, some people, this is natural. Other people, it's something that you learn and you learn to appreciate and you change over time. But if your heart is not in this, the things I'm going to talk about, they'll still work, but they're not going to work really well for you, because people know when you genuinely care for them. And so I would be remiss if I didn't mention that as leaders, sometimes we need to begin with our own hearts when we're working through something as important as a change. People respond differently to change. And I'm going to share something with you. There are a lot of, I've read a lot of books, I've heard a lot of speakers talk about different ways to look at what I'm about to describe. Focus on the concepts, not these numbers. I've seen studies that show these numbers and studies that show other numbers, and that's okay. But anytime that you're leading a change, you're going to find that some subset of the people that you're leading are early adopters. They might actually celebrate the change you announce. They might say, thank goodness, we needed to do this. But they're going to jump on board soon. Now, be careful, because there are a few people in organizations who, I'm just going to speak bluntly, they're brown nosers. They're trying to get ahead, and they might see this as an advantage to influence you. So they're going to pretend to early adopt. But most people, that's not the case. They just, they're change-ready people. They like doing things new. They like trying new approaches, or they already see the problems that the change is trying to solve. They're going to jump on board. And then you're going to have a group. They're going to resist. It doesn't matter what the change is. It doesn't matter how compelling it is, what data you have, what story you tell. Their motto is, hell no, we won't go. But then you're going to have this often referred to as the mighty middle. They're skeptical. They're unsure. They don't really understand what it means yet. They haven't thought through the situation. They're listening to the data. It's going to be the biggest chunk. Whether it's 60%, I don't know, but it's going to be the biggest chunk. And what you want to do is you want to move as many people to the left of this as possible. But this is probably what I'm going to discuss today. This is the most difficult lesson for me to learn. Don't spend a lot of time on the adopters. This is not the best time to go have parties with adopters and celebrate the change you're making. Look, you've already won them over. They've already won themselves over. Now, what you do want to do is spend some time with them, because they can be ambassadors to help you with the skeptics. So you do want to spend some time making sure that they're articulate about the change, make sure they understand what's happening, but don't invest a lot of time here, because if you do, you're going to miss a huge opportunity. Here's where I fall down on this. I tend to focus my attention where the most noise is coming from. The resistors. They're loud. They like to complain. They have a zillion reasons this change won't work. And it's my nature to want to convince them. And I just don't want to give up until they've jumped on board. I want to turn those resistors into adopters. And it's a waste of time. Not in every case, but in most cases, because people who resist are resisting not because the change isn't compelling. They're resisting because it's just not their nature to adapt. So what you want to do here is you want to treat them with respect, show them that you value them, and listen to them, because they often know obstacles that you don't see. You'll make a better change if you listen to them, but don't spend a lot of time there. Speak firmly with them. Let them know a change is coming. The decision has been made. You're open to their input, and you want to listen to them, but don't let them negotiate you out of this change, because the biggest impact you're going to have is right there in that middle. Invest most of your time on these folks. Help them understand, answer their questions, Answer their questions 7 different ways. Sometimes it seems like you go to town halls or team meetings and you get asked the same question over and over, just in different ways. That is helping people catch up. Talk more, talk frequently, engage your leaders in talking more, listen deeply, make sure that these are the ones who are going to make or break your change. It probably won't, there aren't enough early adopters to get you across. So you're going to need those skeptics. So focus your attention there. How fast can you implement change? I've never met a leader who didn't want to move faster than was possible. I've never met a leader who didn't want to move faster than we did. It's our nature as leaders to want to move fast. We've been studying this change, right? We've been thinking about it and we're ready to move on. But the truth of the matter is, change is at the speed of the heart of the individual. You can't move faster than the individuals. In fact, you can't move change without the individuals. The single most important unit of change is the individual. If you can't move the individual, and a lot of them, you can't move the organization. And so you've got to factor in the individuals in your plan. Those individuals will influence other team members. We talked about using the adopters as ambassadors. It's also true that you can't move faster than the teams. So the people who do the work have to change, and you have to tackle them individually and you have to tackle them as a team. The advantage is if the team starts making momentum, the individuals in the team will start joining. If the individuals in the team start making individual momentum, they'll help the team move faster. So if you can figure out ways to tackle the individuals and the teams, you will start seeing momentum. And I'm suggesting that in your change plan, you specifically have tactical things you're doing to target the individuals and target the team. But there's another piece of this, and that is you can't move faster than the speed of the leaders in between you and the individuals. And very often I have seen, this is a failure point, is that people in the middle management, so to speak, very often, not because they're wanting to do anything to harm the change, but they very often don't understand the change well enough, or they're not bought in, or they're not good communicators, or they just don't communicate, and things fall apart right there. So you need to make sure in the change that you're leading that you specifically address them in that and how you're going to handle that. Because at the end of the day, change has to be top down and it has to be bottom up. And what am I really saying here? I'm saying that you will not move any faster than the trust that exists. Stephen Covey has an excellent book called The Speed of Trust. If you haven't read it, I encourage you to go read it. Let's quickly talk about some things that get in the way. I think these are probably the most common causes of change failure I've seen. You have so many people you're used to in business thinking, okay, if I have people and they can handle 17 of these transactions an hour and I have them for 4 hours on this, then they can accomplish this much. It's a mathematical exercise. We understand capacity in that sense, but there's an emotional capacity. There is a mental capacity. There is a physical capacity. There's a human capacity that often gets left out of all of these plans that we're making. There's only so much that we can do at a time. There's only so much change that we can absorb. And then the cup starts overflowing. And it's important to keep that in mind in your plan. And what that means is almost every time, whatever amount of change you think you can accomplish at a time is probably twice more change than you probably can accomplish. It's hard for a leader to accept that. If you're not the top leader, convince a leader you're trying to push too much change quickly. But deniality doesn't change anybody. Also change fatigue. I've been in organizations before when we were making so many changes. You implement one change and immediately you spin up another one. You spin up another one, you spin up another one. And all the changes have value. But the problem is the human capacity to handle that. There was no time to rest in between. It'd be like going to exercise. Instead of exercising an hour and resting and then doing something for another hour, it'd be like going for 2 hours straight. There's a different human impact on that, and there's no difference there. Another problem that has to do something with capacity is death by 1,000 paper cuts. How many times have you been through something where instead of implementing one big change after another, you chunk it up, and very often big change needs to be chunked up. That's a great technique. But if you chunk it up into such small pieces, eventually it's like, one paper cut doesn't cause much blood. but enough paper cuts, then you start seeing some blood. And so sometimes if you chunk them up too small, it can have a toll on the organization. And then there's this other dynamic where you make a change and then you realize, oh wait, no, we shouldn't have done it that way. We probably moved too fast. Let's undo that a little bit and try something different. And then before you know it, it's like you're back and forth, change. The change is changing so much, people can't keep up. The best ideas, I don't care how great the change is, if there's not capacity, the change will die. And there's another dynamic that I've noticed in myself before, and that is very often, by the time I'm launching a change, I've been studying it for a while. I've been working with my team on it. We've got plans in place. We might be months, maybe 6 months into the change before it's announced. And so I'm already planning the next change when we launch it. I've moved on and I am not available to the team because while they're wrestling with a change that I'm now, if you think about the Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, I'm already in acceptance and embracing it over here in anger. I'm with them. And I'm not giving them the emotional support that they need. Real quickly, for rapid change, you need two things to happen. You need to have the capacity for it, and you need to have a strong, compelling desire for it. If you don't have either of those, nothing's going to change. But this is where so many people get stuck. They have a high desire and a compelling change, but they don't have the capacity for it. So they end up with a slow and frustrating change. We won't talk about this, and it doesn't seem to be, at least in my experience, as common, but sometimes you end up with capacity for change, but you don't have clarity over the change, or you don't have a compelling change. And then every department goes off and makes its own change, and that creates chaos. But we won't get into that. We talked about this. Change is hard, and things get worse before they get better. If you want to succeed, you have to have a compelling change, and you've got to have leadership commitment. How do you accelerate change? And I'm going to be back in July to teach a workshop called the influence equation. And so we're going to dig much deeper into that then. But I want to touch on it today because this is how you move people. This is the hand-to-hand combat, so to speak, of the human elements of change. And that is you work through building relationships and through effective communication and by building interpersonal capacity or capability. If you think about it, we talked earlier on another slide that you move at the speed of trust, and these are tools of trust. So we talked about change causes mistrust, it causes ambiguity that leads to disorientation, and then it leads to frustration and resistance and fatigue. Relationships, building relationships increases trust. It creates, we're doing something together. And as humans, we like to do things with other people. It's part of our nature. It builds cooperation. Clear communication creates truth. Sometimes we don't want to hear it, but it is always better to hear the truth than to hear lipstick on a pig. That doesn't serve anyone. And when you speak the truth, even when I don't want to hear it, it reinforces that trust. It reduces ambiguity. It reduces mistrust. So speaking with clarity is important. Speaking with truth is important. It creates a common vision of where we're headed. And if everybody's not headed toward the same goal, we may all get to where we're headed and realize we're not together. You can't just tell somebody something. So communication is more than a one-way, hey, this is what you need to go do. We talked earlier about you can't really control your way into effective change. You need to influence your way into it. You don't tell change, you sell it. And here's where I have to bring up two very important things related to communication. I think these are probably the two most important things about communication in the context of change. Unlike wine, bad news does not get better with time. One of my favorite mentors used to say this all the time. I wish that I could claim credit for this. You, as a leader, when you're leading change, you want to make sure that you have mechanisms in place so that you get early warning. When there's bad news, you don't want anybody to hide bad news, because the sooner you find out there's bad news, the faster you can fix it. I will claim credit for the second piece of this. Unlike coffee conflict does not taste better after it brews. So while you want early detection on bad news, you want early detection on conflict. I was just telling Susan and Vernicia earlier, I've got a workshop that I'm developing called the conflict advantage. Conflict is usually viewed as a bad thing. We often are afraid of it, but at the end of the day, conflict is the way you bring the value of different opinions together into a common objective. But only if you know there's conflict and you deal with it in a healthy way. So early detection is important on these. I don't want to overlook those. Let's talk about interpersonal capability. When people have, sometimes it's referred to as EQ, emotional quotient. When people have the ability to understand themselves, to see themselves, and to understand others better, how they think differently, how they operate differently, you begin to understand like somebody's sense of humor. Someone is really serious all the time, and you interpret it to be one thing until you get to know them and you realize, oh, they have a fun side too. Those kinds of things. If you increase that capacity of your implementing this change, it will increase goodwill. Goodwill is great because every time you implement change, something's going to go wrong. And when it goes wrong, you need the goodwill of those people to say, you know what? I know this went south today, but I believe we can correct it and get back on course tomorrow. It gives people the sense that they are important and that they're valued, and it increases common understanding. These are incredibly important to accelerate your influence and change. I love this statement. This is not mine. Always implementing change. I've understood that it was important in my planning to list out what are my critical success factors. And I was in a workshop where someone taught this is the way they ask their team that question. And so I'm now stealing it. I'm using it. So when you have a change, you ask yourself, what is it that answers this question? Nothing else matters if I don't do X, Y, and Z well. And you keep asking yourself this question. You keep asking your team this question. And eventually you're going to find out what those critical success factors are. They almost always end up involving humans. And that's what you want to pay attention to, because those are the specific aspects of the human elements that you want to address in your change plan. Now think again about that change that you're leading and how these principles might influence that change. So here's something else to think about. We talked about how you build a change plan for a specific change. But there's a larger picture here. The same thing, having no idea where things could get. But just consider in the last 10, 15 years, how technology like the internet and the smartphone have democratized entire business models. We have Uber. Uber is a huge company, a huge company. They don't have employees, they have contractors. And they don't have assets. Those employees, those contractors bring their own assets, cars, to bear for that business model to work. That would not have even been imaginable 20 years ago, probably not even 10 years ago. Consider how iTunes has disintegrated the music industry. It used to be for you to become famous and have a big following for your music career, you had to have a lot of other people involved. And now all you need really is a YouTube and an iTunes account, and you can record something in your home and you're off to the races. Change is constant. And this pandemic is certainly going to speed that up for us here. And if you're going to constantly undergo change and you're going to be leading change, instead of just dealing with each change separately, take steps to improve the change friendliness of the culture you're in. Try to build attitudes and behaviors that make the organization you lead more friendly toward change. Now, it's true, when you're leading a change, you might wish that you had changed some things in the culture before, but that hasn't happened and you don't have time to work on it then. But I love this Chinese proverb. The best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The second best time is now. There's no better time to start working on the culture of your organization to become more change friendly than now. So let's talk about what some of those things are you would want to do. I think this human element is an important part of that culture. You want to go heart first, head second, hands and feet third. And I think this needs to be part of the culture and the way you think. You need to think first about someone's heart and how do you influence their heart. And then there's this intellectual piece of it. You got to convince the head. But at the end of the day, it's hard to get somebody to move, even if you intellectually get them to understand it. Think about changes you've gone through. And you sit there and you listen to the presentation, you say, yeah, that makes sense. But do you get up and go use your hands and feet to go change? Very often, the head can be convinced, but the hands and feet don't follow because the heart is not there. You also want an environment that's focused on growth, that's focused on getting better tomorrow than I was today. That no matter how amazing today was, tomorrow can be better. You want that to be the approach of everything. And consider how, when you have a failure, how you react to a business venture that didn't work, a product launch that fell on its face, how you react helps either build or destroy culture. Oh, what can we learn from it? That builds this kind of culture. Who's at fault destroys this kind of culture. You want a culture that's focused on creativity, rewarding new ideas and experimenting. And in fact, the organizations that are the most innovative are the ones that encourage their teams to go out and fail, because they know that the way you grow is through risk-taking and stretching yourself and getting to the edge of your comfort zone. And when you are there, you're going to fall off that skateboard. You're going to drop one of those balls that you're juggling. But in the process of learning from that, you'll eventually be able to juggle. You'll eventually be able to use that skateboard. You also want an organization that values differences. And I know that diversity is a buzzword that's often used, but the truth of the matter is, this is not just about one kind of diversity. It's multidimensional. It is about people who are from different races and backgrounds and religions, but it's also about people who think differently. I love to have a spreadsheet genius on my team, but I also like to have somebody who likes to talk and who likes to process ideas on a whiteboard. Now, those personalities often conflict, but I like to have them on my team because they both value, because we're looking at the same problem from a different perspective. And if you have a culture that values that, you'll be change friendly. And we talked about the importance of influence over control. When you understand, when you have a culture that understands that you get farther when you influence than when you try to force, then that culture is going to be change friendly. Now, I know this is kind of pie in the sky stuff, and at the end of the day, it's true. You don't change culture with a project. You don't change culture with a public relations campaign. You change culture by changing yourself first as the leader. Chris Hodges, who is a very impressive leader, says that you can't build culture, you have to be culture. And so how do you start planting this tree now in a way that's going to have an impact in your organization culturally? You change. And then you lead your leaders. You model for your leaders for them to change, and they model it for their leaders to change. That's how you change culture. And just to tie this back together, remember that change that you're leading. Let me ask you to consider again how these principles might influence that change that you're leading. And remember that change is first a work of the heart, before it is a work of the head, before it is a work of the hands and the feet. It is first a work of the heart. Your time today. This has been fun. I love this topic. I could talk about this topic for days, but I think we've covered enough material. If you are interested in getting a copy of today's slides, you can go to kevinphillipsslides.com. You can subscribe to my newsletter, and after you subscribe to my newsletter, you'll have access to download the slides. And if you're interested in checking out my website or looking at my social media, I'd love for you to connect with me there. Go to howdykevin.com, and it'll give you a menu of choices of where you can go. When I taught this workshop last month, I was not expecting some of you reached out to me, and I've had some fun conversations, and I've learned a lot from it. And I welcome you to do the same again. Any questions?
Okay, thank you, Kevin. That was one of the questions that several people had is, can we get a copy of the slides? Can we get a copy of the slides? So, and we responded that, thank you for that link, but also we are recording this broadcast, and a link to the broadcast will be available to everyone within 48 hours. So they can also hear your words that supplement the slides. So great. We did have some questions, and just to remind everyone, they can submit their questions at any time using the Q&A feature. So one question on the slide that showed the 20% skeptics on the right side of the scale. What would be a major change activity that would impact, that you would recommend that would impact those skeptics the most?
The 20% on the right were resistors, and the big mighty middle was the skeptics in the middle. And I'm not sure if I understand the question.
Oh, you're right. I think that you were probably right. That was the resistors.
So
Right.
I'm not sure if I'm answering the question, but I will share that I've had a couple of cases in my own personal career where I was wrestling with the resistors. I told you that's my nature, and you reach the point where you have to decide the change is going to happen, and I'm not going to be able to convince them. And you have to have a conversation with them. Says, look, I understand that you don't like this, and I've heard why. I've made some improvements to the change based on what you shared, but the change is going forward, and we need you to go forward. You have a choice to make. We're going forward, with or with. I want you to join us, but you have a choice. And you might not say it that way, but that's the point. You want to make sure they understand you're moving with or without. I'm not sure if that was the question being asked, but
I think that the question was skeptics. So that wasn't the 20%.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Right. No, my fault.
Yeah, I mean, almost every change I've ever implemented, and well, I think every change I've been in, when someone was implementing a change on me, I almost always started out as a skeptic, because I'm unsure. I want to learn a little more before I make a commitment, and I think that very often what happens is the skeptics get lost in all the noise, and it's the noise created by the resistors. So I'm not sure what specifically the question was, but I think what you want to do there is spend a lot of time in focus groups. I like to spend a lot of one-on-one time. If I have people who are influential, they have earned the trust of others because of their credibility, because they've been there a long time, or because they have great accomplishments, or they're very well spoken, whatever it is. I like to spend a lot of one-on-one time with those because I know that I will learn from it, but then they can go out and be ambassadors to those skeptics.
Very good. Thank you. Another question. We know that under stress or adverse conditions, people revert back to their old plan or ways. What have you found works best, or some tips not to revert backwards?
Well, one of my favorite things to do when a change is forced on me is to go back to the old way because it's comfortable. And I've even found that when there's a change that I'm going through that I've imposed upon myself, I tend to want to go back. I went on a diet first quarter of last year to lose 20 pounds. And I mean, it was embarrassing, but despite the fact I wanted to do it, I kept trying to trick myself into going back to the old ways. Look, this is, there are two things. If you're the person that's undergoing the change, this is a matter of discipline. You have to make a choice to do it, discipline yourself. And if you're the leader, you're going to have to put mechanisms in place to make sure that you see when the organization is reverting back to the old ways. Because for both, whether it's you as an individual or you as the leader, there has to be accountability. And if there's not accountability, no change is going to go through. And this is where some of those controls that I mentioned earlier, methods and work breakdown structures and status meetings and having daily huddles in certain cases because change is moving that fast, it is where you can hold yourself and your team accountable by talking about it. What I would encourage you to do, people are going to go back to their natural ways. Part of it's because they're learning a new skill they forgot. Part of it's because the new skill's hard and the other one's comfortable, they have muscle memory. Part of it's because they're resisting. Doesn't matter. Be gentle when people go back. Don't start blaming people. Try to figure out why. Start by trying to have a conversation about it. And then sometimes there's another piece of this too, I just remembered. And this won't work in every case, but I ran call centers. And one of the things that we often have are tools that help the call center reps perform. So we always would try to figure out what can we get the tools to do to help make the change more effective so that it wasn't entirely upon the backs or the burden of the call center reps to make the change. So there are sometimes things you can do in the process or with your technology to help make the change easier for them to adapt.
Okay, thank you, Kevin. Another question, what types of programs do you do for companies that will help them implement a changed culture?
Well, there are two things that I do. What I taught today was designed originally as a full day experience where the first half of the day I am teaching a workshop in a little bit more detail than this. And in the second half of the day, what I do is we actually take the change that they're implementing and I facilitate a session where we use these principles and apply them in their change plan that they're building. That's really how this was designed. Now, what I've done besides that is sometimes I'm just doing a workshop like I did here today.
Okay, thank you, Kevin. Let's see. Here's another question. I'm not in charge of the change programs. I usually have only a piece. How can I convince the change leader to consider these people aspects?
Well, in my case, I've never been the CEO of AT&T, so I always had other leaders who were involved, and so I've been through this before often. Look, I find that it is far more effective to talk about the impacts of change than to try to tackle someone and argue with them head on. You're almost always going to lose an argument, especially if someone feels strongly about something. So instead of me trying to persuade another leader with a powerful presentation or an astounding conversation that I would lead, instead I just try to start asking questions about the people impacts of this, or hey, how are we going to handle that, and how long do we think it's going to take for somebody to unlearn this old habit and learn this new habit. I might ask about a metric target, for example. Is this going to increase our absentee rate because people are stressed, and have we factored that into the plan? Because in the process of asking that question, it's causing people to think through the people impacts without me saying, hey, you should be thinking about the people impacts. So I think the best way to do this is actually talk about the actual change itself and the human impacts in the question form.
Okay, thank you. Another question, you talk about how change is personal, and I understand the point you're making, but don't you have to be careful not to cross a line into people's personal lives? Won't that muddy the line and complicate difficult decisions and actions you might have to take?
That's a great question, and it's also a fair point that's worth discussion. The first aspect of me saying that change is deeply personal is really aimed at leaders being aware of it. I am absolutely not suggesting that a leader should get in the middle of someone's personal business. But first, they should be aware of it personal, because if you understand that what you do at work today is going to cause a problem at home, and you should care about that because what happens at home is going to come and impact you at work tomorrow, I think that might change the way you think about the change in your actions and your behaviors. But the second aspect of this is something that we talked about in the influence equation part of this discussion. I'll talk about it more in July as well, is if you don't know someone, it's going to be hard to lead them. I'm not saying you can't lead someone you don't know, but the better you know them, the better you can lead them. And the more they trust you, the better you can lead them. And so it is personal. And to the extent that you can increase your understanding of them and help them get to know you better, you are going to find you have more influence with them. And the more influence you have, the more that you'll be able to guide them to the change. I'm not suggesting you should cross some line and get in the middle of their business. Now, certainly business relationships can become personal friendships. Many of my best friends started out as business relationships, and you've got to be careful about that. So it's a fair point to keep us reminded of.
And Kevin, you're so open, and I can see where you would gain trust very, very quickly with your employees. And we've had some comments that people would like to see you on the next webinar. So think about that if you're willing to share your camera.
Yeah, I am willing to do that. I'm not much to look at, but I'm perfectly happy to let you see them.
Okay, I think that's about all for the question time that we have. So let's move on. If you want to reach out to Kevin, he gave you his contact information, and we'd encourage you to do that. You can certainly visit our website at talentconnections.net for upcoming webinars, as well as a link to this recorded webinar. The activity number for this webinar is 20-5 V as in Victor, QW9. And that has been approved for 1 professional development credit for recertification through SHRM. So thank you again, Kevin. And I'm sure everyone's looking forward to your July webinar, and we appreciate your time today.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone.